So welcome everybody. I don't know who is attending at the moment, but I feel like there might be some overlap between those who attended my job demand assessment presentation in September. And if there is, that this is going to be different. It's going to be a little bit of a different take on job demand assessments because we're still talking about job demand assessments, but we're going to focus more on cognitive demands and psychosocial hazards and things like that. As always, I'll talk about how to use the job demand assessments because I think they're really important. I think that they are a really valuable tool for every organization that has them, and I think that they can be used quite widely. So I will kind of get into it here. And my slides are not moving. There we are. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of what is a job demand assessment. We'll talk about what kind of materials a job demand assessment should have, how the information is typically collected, what the ergonomist or the analyst needs to know when they're collecting data and how they can do it effectively, who's writing the job demand assessment, how are job demand assessments being used, and throughout this presentation in particular, we're going to be using examples from the WCD Alberta's cognitive psychosocial job demand assessment template because it's pretty good. So we're going to use that as our example. And then we'll go into Q&A if you have any questions. So essentially, I like to start off with a couple of definitions just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understanding kind of what I'm talking about. So a job demand assessment is a systematic method of collecting data, evaluating the data, and representing the information required to complete a job. This document provides an objective way of representing skills and abilities required to perform the job effectively. So the details in the job demand assessment would be kind of the minimum required demands. It wouldn't include things like, oh, sometimes I help out, the other coworkers because I'm a nice person. It would be what is required in your job, because ultimately these job demand assessments are often used to help keep people at work if they're injured, or return them back to work following an injury. So keeping things kind of as black and white as possible makes that process a little bit more streamlined. So one of the other, little pieces of terminology that I just want to highlight is some of the lingo that ergonomists use. So we've got occupations, that's kind of the broader scope of a job. And then within that occupation, you might have, kind of different jobs. So usually based on seniority or maybe a few different tasks involved. And so a task is a specific element within each job. So analysts and ergonomists typically break down jobs into several tasks, so several manageable pieces. And then we talk about those demands within each of those tasks. And I'll talk about a little example here. So for example, the occupation in question may be a gardener. And if you've got an organization where you've got many, then you probably have a couple of different jobs between each. For this example, we've got a junior gardener and a senior gardener. And then they all have they have some of the same shared tasks. For example, planting trees, pruning bushes, fertilizing, driving to different sites, and then scheduling. So in this particular example, we've highlighted things so that, most of the main gardening tasks are completed by both jobs, but scheduling is completed only by the senior gardener. So this kind of becomes interesting because with this one job in particular that I'm talking about, the senior gardener spends maybe 30 to 45, maybe 50% of their time, depending on seasons, doing scheduling. So that means the bulk of their work, or probably half of their work, is spent, talking on the phone, doing computer work, things like that. And it just gives them less exposure to a lot of the other variables. And it means that the junior gardeners have more exposure to some of the more physically demanding items. Nothing is bad or good from this. It's just recognizing that, you've got 100% of a job, and if you're doing one thing, you're not doing the other. So I like to kind of establish that at first. So I do find that more senior roles typically have more cognitive-based tasks associated with them. They might even just be a second glance at a product or a document for quality control, which means that those senior people may have more decision-making responsibility. And senior employees typically have, a few more tricks to the trade, and they have more familiarity with a lot of those other tasks, and they can provide valuable information to the junior employees on how to do their jobs more effectively or efficiently, or just to recognize a few different things. So we will talk a little bit about that later, but I just wanted to establish kind of occupations, jobs, and then tasks. And just that we have 100% of a job to be completed, and usually there's some physical components and some cognitive components. So when we're talking about job demand assessments, even within my field of ergonomists, we all have to talk about things slightly differently. So when I first started doing these, about 20 or so years ago, it was all about physical demands assessment, and everything had to do with physical demands. And after a while, it was kind of like, well, we're not really like evaluating the job, we're just describing the job. So the lingo kind of switched over to more of a physical demands description, because we're not, when we do job assessments or physical demands descriptions, physical demands assessments, we are looking at what is required in the job. We're not saying whether it's bad or whether it's good or whether anything needs to be improved. We're just saying this is how things are. Recently, well, maybe not recently, definitely in the last 20 years, there have been cognitive elements associated with job demand assessments that have kind of changed the lingo a little bit more from physical demands assessments and description, more of, this is kind of the job as a whole. There's physical components, there's cognitive components, and it all makes up the job. So usually when I'm completing job demand assessments for people, for different companies, my job demand assessments have a physical demand component and a cognitive demand component. With some clients, I use a slightly different template because perhaps the cognitive demands are going to be a lot stronger in this job, and that needs to be more reflected, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about more in this presentation, more so than physical demands. So if you haven't, if you don't have experience with physical demands descriptions and things like that, you will get some of that out of this presentation as well. I've also seen some ergonomists call their document a physical and cognitive demands assessment. Like that's all fantastic. As a company, I think it's important to know if you're hiring somebody to do your physical demands assessment, if you can see a template, or ask if the ergonomist or the analyst have a few different templates that you might be able to choose from and look at, just to make sure that the information that you're getting is going to be what's usable for you. So I think it's super important to have a physical component with every single job. A physical demands will look at postural strength and mobility demands. It usually also incorporates sensory and environmental demands, so environmental distractions and things like that. We look at physical demands are important because we might need to accommodate somebody for an injury, and sorry about that. We might be accommodating somebody for an injury, but the cognitive demands are really important too, because we have cognitive injuries also. So sometimes people are in motor vehicle collisions, they have a concussion, they're still looking to come back to work. Cognitive demand assessment typically refers to the type of required thinking and reasoning demands that are required in a job. So when I'm talking about a job demand assessment in this presentation, just know that I'm talking about a document that's going to incorporate both the physical and cognitive demands in the same thing. So one thing that's really important is to, like I said, consider the needs of your organization. How will the job demand assessments be used? Are you going to be using them for returning people to work? Have you been using them to return people back to work? Some of the clients that I see have documents that they've been using for more than 20 years, and they're really good. And then they say, you know what, like, we think they just need a little bit of an update. Like, the job is still the same, but there's a few things that are a little bit different, Annie. They might say, the pictures are out of date. We've got people working on computers and they've got one screen, but right now they have 3 screens. So that's a little bit different. And, we have some hybrid work as well. So we want to recognize that people are sometimes working from home. With other positions, they say, you know what, we've got a field work component that isn't really reflected in the job. So I think it's important to just make sure that the job is always accurate and always reflective of what is being done. To that point too, it's really important to involve the people who are going to be using the job demand assessments afterwards, just to make sure that the information that they're getting is going to be usable to them. In my role, I complete a lot of physical demands assessments, lots of job demand assessments, lots of specific cognitive demand assessments. I also do an ergonomics assessment where we kind of look at the required demands and determine if things need to be optimized. And I also do some return to work. So when I'm writing, I kind of keep all of those things in the back of my mind. Like, what would I want to know if I was bringing somebody back to work from a shoulder injury? Or what would I want to know if I was bringing somebody back from a knee injury? Or what would I want to know if somebody's disclosed that they are struggling with the effects of some of their medications, if they've got a recent ADHD diagnosis, those types of things. And they've got restrictions from their physician. That's the other key part. Having restrictions from a physician allows the return to work coordinator to kind of put these 2 pieces together to come up with a solution that's going to work for the worker and the workforce. Some other organizations just want to check a box. You know what? We've got job demand assessments for all of our jobs. Perfect. That's all we want. There's a place for you too, because I think even if you are just checking a box, I'm hoping that after this presentation, you'll realize that, you know what, I'm just checking a box, but I can also apply these job demand assessments for so many other different things, especially if detail and quality matters. Because different templates will allow you to go into less detail or more detail. If you've got an organization that's using these all the time for return to work, pretty clear comment section will be really helpful, just to make sure that the people putting or trying to bring somebody back to work have a lot of context for what's required in the job. If you're using these for claims management, all of those details matter. With non-cyclic jobs, it's often challenging to incorporate all of the different details that might be encountered within the job. But a detailed document that allows for context and if this then statements, then for the people in charge of returning people back to work, it makes them it makes their job of finding opportunities for modified work a lot easier. Or to be able to say, you know what, we are not going to be able to offer modified work for this position. Or to be able to say, you know what, when I was talking about some of those tasks, we can pull some of these tasks out that are going to be a problem for this individual, and then that will be no problem at all. I'm pretty passionate about making sure that people can return back to work in a timely manner. So what does a job demand assessment usually have? So a comprehensive job demand assessment will have a number of different items, headings of various lengths. So it's always going to have a job title and a short job description, just to kind of get people familiar with what's going on. You have to remember that while these job demand assessments are used primarily internally, there are definitely times where they go external to the company, sometimes to a psychologist, sometimes to a physician, sometimes to a physiotherapist, sometimes to anybody who's trying to help somebody get back to work, or if they're trying to learn a little bit more about the job. They will often go to WCB as well if WCB is involved in approving or denying a claim. They will want to have a look. So having a short job description just helps everybody out. The job demand assessment should also have a clear statement of what the shift times are and schedule and breaks, and whether things are fixed or whether they are, a little flexible. There should be some job demand assessments include a task breakdown. Some do not, depends on the template. I prefer having tasks because I like to be able to group different demands and items if I can. Job demand assessments have photographs. These are so important to demonstrate to the reader some of the postures or machinery or other interactions that just might not be clear in the reading. The picture truly does say 1,000 words. Many job demand assessments include the type of equipment and tools that are used. Once again, really helpful if you've got somebody who's operating a vehicle, if they're operating a personal vehicle, if they're operating forklifts, if they're operating a crane, if they are a professional driver who is spending a lot of time on the highways. You just want to kind of have those things in mind, especially on a day like today. I don't know how many of you are in Calgary, but the roads are pretty special today with snow and ice. Most job demand assessments have a section for cognitive and psychosocial demand ratings, and sometimes these sections are larger than others. Once again, it just kind of depends on the template that you're working in and the focus of the job and how the job's going to be used. They also look at environmental and job demands. Is the job indoors? Is it outdoors? Do they have to wear PPE? That type of thing. Or is it indoors and they're still exposed to heat? Or are they working indoors in a freezer? Meat processing, that type of thing. There's always a section on strength demands. So how much is somebody lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling? What kind of arm work is required? What kind of postures are required to do the job? Why are those postures required? What kind of mobility demands are required? This is so important for return to work. Ladder climbing is very different from stair climbing. With ladder climbing, you've got your arms involved. In stair climbing, you don't. And also A-frame ladders versus vertical ladders. Those are really going to change the demands that your knees feel. So putting in specifics like that makes a difference. Sensory demands and the kind of flexibility, or flexibility is not the right word. Sensory demands and some variability can be really helpful as well. You know, somebody who's working in a private office has a lot more control over their illuminance and lighting and sound. They can close the door if they need to. Whereas somebody working in an open office has less control over those things. AirPods or something to cover your ears, maybe a headset might be a requirement of the job if you're spending a lot of time on the phone. But sometimes people have sensory issues with their skin and their ears and things like that, and they need, you know, different types of hearing protection. So hearing protection or phone communication. So just adding those little pieces of information in makes just everybody's life a lot easier, because it lets them know, oh, you know, this job requires wearing a headset. Is that going to be a problem? No, perfect. All right. Or, oh, yes, it is going to be a problem. Then you know that you need to make a change. Sensory demands also include things like smelling, tasting, seeing, touching. Are you doing a physical inspection of something? Are you a food quality tester? How important is taste? If you're sick with a cold or COVID, you might have some deficits in your smelling and tasting ability, and so that might make things a little challenging. So just adding that detail really helps. I also think really important to include the name of the person who is completing the assessment and their credentials, and a date. Dates are great. Oftentimes jobs, you know, stay the same. I referenced looking at job demand assessment that was about 20 years old, and I was like, yeah, this is like still pretty much the same. And you just kind of update it, add a new date, just so that when people are reviewing, they know, okay, yeah, it's still relevant. Sometimes with clients, if I've done JDAs for them in the past, and they just want to make sure things are the same, I do a review with the supervisor and the worker, make sure everything's still the same, and then we just reissue with a new date. Makes things a lot easier. So I said I wanted to talk a little bit about psychosocial demands. And so this is just a little description here. So most of them will add in, have these topics. You know, memory, for example, some might differ between short-term memory, long-term memory, ability to recall within a certain time frame, that type of thing. And the examples I'm going to show you in more detail have a little different categories for intensity and frequency. So I just wanted to give you a little preview here. So we've got memory, we've got attention to detail, completing multiple tasks, mental endurance, problem solving, decision making, how much accountability is required in the job. You know, if you're thinking about those junior employees versus the senior employees. Are they required to self-supervise? Are they required to supervise others? What kind of time pressures are involved? What's the exposure to environmental distractions? So beeping, different signals. Are they required to work cooperatively with others, and in what capacity and when? What is the exposure to emotional situations and emotional people? Confrontational situations, confrontational people. What does verbal communication look like? You know, for example, is verbal communication always over the telephone, or sometimes is it face-to-face where you can use gestures or expression with your face or other things? I think that going into these details is pretty important. Many templates for cognitive demands assessments have a legend or a reference book associated with them to ensure repeatability between analysts. Collecting data for cognitive demands is often more challenging than collecting data for physical demands, especially if you're looking at a specific job. You don't want to take, one person's perspective and decide that that's how the job needs to be done. It's important to interview several people in the same role, and then be able to get a really good picture of whether you're properly rating the job in terms of intensity of demand and the frequency style. So when I'm completing the cognitive aspect of job demand assessments, I typically move into kind of interview mode. I ask a lot of questions like, how would you, perform, how would you react if this particular scenario happened, or describe a situation where you were really challenged, or if there was an assault at this location, how would you handle it? I also ask them to describe in their feelings what a really hectic or busy or really bad day looks like. And then I ask them, what kind of a slow day looks like, what a typical day looks like. I always build up the answers with follow-up questions. Things like, when I'm getting them to describe their really busy bad day, I say, okay, well, has that ever happened? And how often a year does that happen? How often a month does that happen? How often a week does that happen? Because that really gives me a pretty good picture of what kind of demands are required. The analyst is responsible for the rating of each job demand. So it's really important to be confident in the rating. One example I frequently refer to, some of you may have heard this already. I was doing job demand assessments for some security guards. And the security guard was one position, and but they worked in different buildings. Let me just tell you, the physical and cognitive demands really did change per building. In some buildings there were a lot of events happening outside of their facility where they really did need to call emergency services quite frequently. They had to, in their role as a security guard, they were administering Narcan for overdoses outside of the facility quite often. It wasn't just a need to have first aid and CPR on to be part of their job, but they were actually completing CPR quite frequently. So those at some buildings. So the physical and cognitive demands really changed per building. So it was really helpful for the client to have some of these things documented, because they had a sense that there were some things that were really different. We've got this job, it should be the same everywhere, but it's really different in all of these different locations. And we just want to be able to have this documented properly, so that we can manage claims within our workers, and we can make sure that everybody's safe, and maybe even try to optimize the job conditions so that our workers aren't exposed to all of this all the time. So that's just one example of where these job demand assessments can be used kind of beyond their original purpose. So for data collection, I always want somebody to collect data during a typical day of work, observe and interview trained employees doing the job in the right way. They should talk to supervisors before and after just to make sure things are right. And the supervisor and employees should always review the job demand assessment to make sure that it is accurate. So who completes job demand assessments on the cognitive side, and how do we do this? So I alluded to, the physical demands assessments. I went into a little bit more detail with this in the other presentation, but we use lots of different tools to determine how much force is being applied, how much weight is being handled. We use a lot of stopwatches. We use a lot of scales, force gauges to determine push and pull frequencies. With the cognitive side of things, we're usually doing an interview and writing notes or on an iPad or something like that. So ergonomists are trained to do these. There's a few other specialists who have taken some training to do cognitive demands assessments and physical demands assessments. So essentially the person writing the job demand assessment should be somebody who really clearly understands the demands of a job and can quantify the demands of the job based on intensity and frequency. It's important to be objective and to put in objective measures whenever you can. A physical example that comes to mind is putting in measurements. So for example, the employee's working at a bench at a height of 36 inches. I very clearly know that this is the height of the bench, and that is the height of the bench, regardless of whether the person working there is 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall or 6.5 feet tall. Instead of saying they work at a bench that is approximately waist height. I don't know how high waist height is. I don't know how tall that person is. So it's important to find opportunities for objectivity to put in there. In terms of who should be completing them, the Occupational Health Clinics of Ontario workers says that if the worker or consultant performing the observation and data collection isn't a Canadian certified professional ergonomist, then he or she should have appropriate training in conducting physical demands descriptions. The training should include multiple elements such as task analysis, observation, measurement, data collection, photography, and video recording and documentation. I do think that if the job is going to be complex or possibly contentious, then having a certified ergonomist or a third party just kind of does make sense, and it might even be a good investment. But we can talk about that later if you have a few more questions. So I wanted to get into some of the detail with the newly launched cognitive psychosocial JDA template launched by the WCB Alberta. So the website listed at the bottom of this slide is where you can find a copy of this PDF document. It's 7 pages long. It has a lot of information that you'd want to record. One thing that's interesting about this psychosocial, this job demand template that I thought was a little bit different from ones I usually use is that they're really getting at, what happened at the time of the incident. You'll note that the date of the accident, job demand of frequency is highlighted. So they really do want to know for their assessment, if something is usually happening on a rare basis or occasional basis, but on the day of the incident, their exposure to something was constant. That's something that's a little bit different. So we're not going to go through all of the different elements. I just wanted to show a few examples and provide a little bit of context with them. So for short-term memory and recall, like all of the different elements for cognitive demand assessment, there's going to be intensity levels. And there's guidance for what this intensity level might look like. So for example, maybe short-term memory and recall is not required. Or maybe it's a low demand. Maybe there's minimal need to remember and recall information that is applied to work tasks on a very frequent basis, so people would be used to it. Maybe there's very clear work instructions that they're following and they don't deviate from that. So, that would be low demand. Or you might go into another workplace where there's, or another occupation job where there's a moderate demand. So you are sometimes required to recall information that's harder to remember because you're not exposed to it very often. You might have to say, just let me look that up. I think I know where to find it. Just give me a second. Or there might be time constraints on when to recall this information, like if it's an emergency situation. Or if there might be a high demand where you are required to know this information right away. Many different pieces of information in a demanding situation or very tight timelines. So checking off the appropriate box for the intensity gives the person managing the claims some context on what's happening. I also pulled up the completing multiple tasks option because many people think that they are multitasking on a variety of different things. And when I really look at jobs, there are few jobs that require as much multitasking as we think. We are in some roles, I want you to be a very good monotasker. I want you to work on one job until it's finished. You might be paying attention to lots of different things, but you might not be simultaneously completing a lot of tasks. So just being able to look at that demand and assess. I find often when I'm doing job demand assessments and I'm trying to figure out, is there a low demand of multitasking, or is there a moderate demand of multitasking, or maybe there's a high demand of moderate of multitasking. I try to find examples within, if it isn't clear to me, that I look for examples of why it isn't high or why it isn't low, and then maybe I ultimately decide on, it is moderate. The comments section. There's comment section on the right-hand side on the completing multiple tasks. I cut it off just so that you could read the details a little bit better. But there's comments in each section, which I feel are very important to include so that you can describe, why it is why the job is high and why it is not moderate. I think that makes it really clear for the analyst. The other section, I just wanted to highlight here, just away from the example, is that the intensity level is really important. And I think that having a not required as an option is really important, because then it just allows you to kind of move on. Typical demands and exceptional demands for job intensity level is helpful for return to work coordinators so that they can determine schedules and work plans that allow the worker to be successful. You always want to provide examples for context because you don't know which specialty is going to be looking out for returning somebody back to work. I also pulled up some examples for mental endurance and for time pressures, because sometimes these are areas where we frequently need to be able to make accommodations. So you can see if for mental endurance is defined as the ability to effectively perform work tasks for a long period of time with little opportunity for breaks due to the nature of work being performed. So it includes the ability to work regular, rotating, overnight, or on-call shifts. Depending on somebody's situation, they may have challenges with that. So you may be looking at mental endurance as a section for cues on where you can modify somebody's work. Same with time pressures. If somebody's having issues with meeting specific time demands, you may be able to look at the task to say, okay, you know what, maybe we can modify something here. Maybe we change a metric of some sort. With frequency, so the frequency of exposure is the same one that's used for physical demands and cognitive demands. So I think this is really important. If you go back to my gardener example too, you can see that if that gardener the senior gardener is spending quite a bit of time, frequent, if you say so, between more than a third of their day is spent doing some of that administrative type work, then it means they have less time to do some of the other tasks that might be more physically demanding. So this is a really good reference form that I go back to frequently so that you just tell the difference between what does rare mean anyway, what does occasional mean anyway, in terms of timelines? They've even split it out. So rare means you're exposed to it for less than 12 minutes per shift. If it's a 4-hour workday, 8-hour workday, less than half an hour per shift, 25 minutes to be exact. So many jobs that require a heavy cognitive side might be because they're exposed to emotional people or emotional situations. So if you think of a lot of call center workers, a lot of frontline employees who do a lot of frontline work with customers, they are probably going to have higher demand and intensity demand and exposure level to some of those emotional situations. One element that's part of many job demand assessments, and I think the WCB Alberta did a really great job in splitting this out, is they've asked, is the job safety sensitive? They've defined safety sensitive as a job where a lapse in memory, attention, or problem solving could impact personal safety or the safety of others. So are you required to drive a vehicle where something might happen? And that might impact your safety and somebody else's safety. So a case that some occupations are, professional driver, like I just mentioned, perhaps a nurse, anyone that's exposed and working with other people, frontline work. They've also defined risk sensitive. So a position or type of positions that's typically kind of away from the work site, but they have the authority to direct that safety sensitive work for their employees. So for example, that might be, somebody very high in the ranks in policing or other emergency services, or supervisors, utilities, for example. So these might be supervisors, technical experts, somebody who has been asked for their opinion on something, and then the employees are potentially conducting those safety sensitive tasks. So if you have a risk sensitive job, you're probably responsible for the safety sensitive work that other people are doing. Performance limitations could result in an incident or near miss as described above. They also just ask, is the job decision critical? So whereby a lapse in memory, attention, or concentration can impact effective performance, productivity, finances, reputation and liability of the workplace. So it could be limited to property damage, all kinds of different delayed completion of time-sensitive jobs or losing lots of money. So those occupations could be, corporate executives, for example, somebody whose job is pretty important, but might not be risk sensitive or safety sensitive. We're talking about more finances and reputation. So I've tossed around a few different terminologies. So I wanted to go back and just I talked a little bit about this at the other job demand assessment presentation, but what's the difference between a job demand assessment versus an ergonomics assessment versus kind of return to work assessment? So job demand assessment is kind of a key tool that can help you do any of these other tasks. So the job demand assessment will describe what's required in the job, and then an ergonomics risk assessment can take these job demands and then compare them to a standard to see if the injury risk is high or low, or what we can do to mitigate injury risk. And then with respect to return to work, maybe you have a documentation from the position with some restrictions, and then you've got the job demand assessment. You can kind of compare the two to see if there's a match or if there's elements that will not work out, and if those can be accommodated for. I think the goal should always be for a speedy and safe return to work for the employee. So how to use these job demand assessments? So I really think that they can be used in a ton of different places internally by different groups. If you don't have job descriptions, you can complete them. You can use it for job postings. You can use it, when you're interviewing new candidates, so that they know what they're going to be getting into with jobs. Because sometimes people go into a job and they just don't know that night shift means that you have to work nights every single day, or that a supervisory position, you're expected to supervise individuals and you probably need to have some face-to-face time with them, and you probably have limited opportunities to participate in a return to a remote work situation, depending on what the job demand is. You can also look at safety components. You can look at that with respect to medications that people might be on that they've disclosed. They're really important. They can be used by engineers. I've worked with quite a few engineering groups when they're changing up different layouts or equipment and finding out, is there an issue with the current stuff? Can we optimize this with our new plans? So I wanted to just briefly talk about just a couple of case studies, just very briefly, because I know we're kind of coming up to the end here. So I was using a job demand assessment for call center employee. This was in a large telecommunications company. They had some accommodations that they needed to be made for migraines. So in this one particular case, it was no problem for the employee to work from home, where they had control over the lighting and noise. In other locations, sometimes you're able to, have an office to the side, or if it's an open area, you might even be able to have them in a corner where they have more control over things like that. Sometimes, and then in this case, we also allowed for some more time was allowed in between calls, just to reduce some time pressures. With another employee, this was with a utility. They needed some accommodations for ADHD, and on the autism spectrum, and they're going through some depression. So really motivated to keep them at work. We were able to work on a reduced work week. This reduced some of their time pressures. We allowed for some different metrics for call length, which reduced some of the multitasking required. And we were able to incorporate some non-phone related duties for part of the shift, which reduced the mental endurance that was kind of required in the job. Sometimes if you're allowed to have longer time per call and between calls, that can allow the employee to control themselves better and manage expectations and ensure that they don't become overwhelmed. One point is if people are used to returning injured employees with a physical injury back to work, that gradual return to work can be a little bit more unpredictable for mental health recovery. So for example, with a graduated return to work for a physical injury, you might have kind of a 4-week plan. If you are accommodating somebody for mental health, you may need to have a longer plan. Depression and anxiety and other mental health concerns, and also concussion management can be unpredictable, and especially if medication and dosaging is required. Sometimes employees are dealing with kind of physical side effects from medication, so maybe more fatigue, brain fog. And so when they're trying to get used to a new medication, but also trying to return to work, it can be a lot to manage. So you may need to allow more time for a shift. We've also done return to work with professional employees working in professional services. So this, for example, this was an engineer who needed some accommodations because of some medication side effects, affecting memory, concentration. This was pretty easy. It was just a discussion, and we were able to shift the work times. They felt more fatigued at the end of the workday, so we were able to shift the work time, and that worked really well to allow them to have better, memory recall during the day, reduced fatigue when they were at work. It was fairly easy for the workplace to accommodate too, which was nice. And then I mentioned earlier that on an external basis, from your workplace, there might be people viewing these job demand assessments. So it's really helpful to have a lot of detail that might help the physician, WCB and other insurance providers, psychologists, just so that they know kind of what the employee is going back to. You want the healthcare providers to have an understanding of the tasks that the workers actually complete on a day-to-day basis during their jobs. This assists in creating an effective treatment plan that considers the impact of work and can help the employee return to work quickly and safely. So when to update a job demand assessment, I guess if there's any physical changes in the job, change in production rates, change in machinery, tools added, workstation layout, new products, new tasks involved, maybe even adding in different supervisory demands. The work reorganization, that kind of alludes to a lot of the cognitive demands that you might encounter. So that concludes this webinar. I would love to